for today. So I want to tell you a little bit more about Arathi. She is, in addition to her fellowships here at Harvard, that's only the latest snazzy thing on her resume. If we can just see her bio line, you'll see that Arathi is also a noted commentator and really like one of the leading voices in the practitioner space when it comes to humanitarian technology and also just the future of humanitarianism writ large. You can find some of her previous work in The New Humanitarian and in other writings. So Arathi, I'm going to kick it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your current research?
Hi, Caitlin, and hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's a thrill. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm a little bit nervous, I have to admit. So for those that don't know me, I'm Arathi Krishnan. I've been in the humanitarian sector for a bit too long, I think, but I've started my research fellowship at Harvard, both at, as you've said, Caitlin, at both at Berkman and at Carr. And what I am interested to unpack through my journey is to what would it mean and what would it take for us to develop decolonial practices in our digital governance policies. And why I sort of came to that was a recognition and a realization that most of us here in the humanitarian sector are designing policies, digital approaches, digital data governance processes based on an assumption of the status quo. And when we are not paying attention to how these systems are designed, we run the risk of designing and replicating the inequities of the past. Humanitarianism this year in particular is going through a bit of an existential crisis, I would say. And I felt that this might be a good time to unpack this. I want to preface this by saying I'm here I'm so happy to participate in this webinar, to share ideas and thoughts that are framing the start of my journey. I'm not going to pass myself off as an expert in this because this is, I think, a learning process for all of us. I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I'm opening myself up a little bit to saying I might be very wrong here with a lot of the hypotheses and premises I'm putting out, but I welcome collective learning, collective brainstorming, and if anybody wants to participate in this journey with me and with us, I absolutely and truly lean into that and welcome that. Thank you, Caitlin. Back to you.
Well, Arathi, I'll say as a Kennedy School grad and having been on Harvard staff now for a few years, we really don't encourage that kind of humility here. So you just got to claim that expertise, whether it's warranted or not. I will say, I think for all of us, we're really excited that you have this fellowship time to actually pause and do some of the writing that's so essential. I think I was following you on Twitter the other day and sort of a commentary on how for those of us when you're sort of watching the practitioner space, there are so many incredible insights and opportunities that we often can sort of only grasp at in the occasional like blip on social media, occasionally in an interview, and sometimes we get sort of a full report out. But it's really hard to actually take the time away from doing the work, especially the kind of complex work with data governance strategies and thinking through, this much more like futurism approach to humanitarian work. That means doing really important stuff, usually on the ground and with a lot of the people who are making it happen on a day-to-day basis. So we're just happy that you're able to pause for a second, take a breath, and use this time for some reflection, because we think that learning is really critical. So we're really happy that you're here. And for those of you who are watching, please know that she is in fact being too modest. So I want to put this a little bit in context of some of the work that we've been doing at the Signal program. So we've been focusing on a lot of different things when it comes to the standards and ethics space. And we also try to inhabit the space as practitioners as well, using sort of like applied methodologies, applied research in everything from the context of trying to forecast and then monitor mass atrocities as they emerge, to looking at disasters, resiliency, figuring out how we can sort of support the better and sort of stronger use of tech by humanitarians during human rights and humanitarian emergencies. But when it comes to the standards and ethics space, we kept coming up short with our own standards. We had sort of a hodgepodge of ethics that were borrowed from well-tested sort of like bioethics and medical ethics, all of which have been passed down and are really integrated into university systems through institutional review boards. But as soon as we started using satellite imagery, which doesn't capture what would be technically defined as personally identifiable information, the university was like, well, you're not doing that, so go ahead. And there's a lot less when it comes to not only oversight, but also like really important checkpoints along the way to see if how you are practicing your research continues to actually be ethical, or at what point do you cross that line into experimentation with people who have never had an opportunity to give consent, let alone actually be asked for it. Then we get into a space. So out of that experience, we started to draft the signal code, looking really to try and identify the core human rights that we felt were at the center of all of this work, and then work our way backwards from the aspiration to fulfilling those rights to the obligations that we believe we hold as humanitarians. And now increasingly, we're working on the minimum technical standards. So earlier this week, we released two really important updates in that space. One, working alongside Mercy Corps and their incredible work to connect refugees around the world to the internet and to information as aid, which is, I think, a really, really noble enterprise. And we issued guidelines for exactly like what humanitarians looking to establish internet connectivity in camps could look like and what some of the minimum requirements ought to be. And again, to echo you, Arati, that is very much a work in progress. We're putting out the first working draft. It's by no means the final word on it. We engaged in a similar process with you aviators, looking to see how drones being used in humanitarian contexts ought to be applied, what needs to be understood about the data, the work stream. And through both of those, we kept kind of coming back to figuring out, like saying, okay, a lot of our existing guidance is framed around the humanitarian practitioner rather than the beneficiary of the aid. And all of the limitations, certainly there's a fair amount that is driven towards ensuring that aid is in fact delivered, that it's delivered well, that's done professionally. But there wasn't as much that came up that was actually emphasizing how the humanitarian needed to navigate risk in order to ensure that aid was being delivered in the way it ought to be, and assuming risk in places where it's appropriate, instead of placing additional risk on the part of the beneficiary. So these key questions of who bears what risk, what does that actually look like, how does that take place on in the field itself? These were all some key questions we kept coming back to. So with that, I want to just give us sort of an overview of what we're going to go over today. We're going to get into digital decolonization, what it is, what it isn't, how we think about these things in humanitarian spaces that are sort of increasingly defined by data and technology, which is certainly an important evolution and one that we have to really kind of work our way through carefully. We're going to be talking a little bit about ethics and ethical conduct and what the fundamentals, what the basis of our current ethics even are. Who drafted them? Who do they serve? Who bears what risk? And we're going to be rethinking a little bit some of the premises of how our current humanitarian principles and ethics are drafted on that basis. We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of rights in the 21st century and get into our obligations to recognize injustice and unequal structures. And I think we're probably going to go a step further from recognizing the obligations to figuring out what kind of meaningful next steps can we take to create change? What sort of objectives can we actually achieve through humanitarian information activities, data governance? Where's there potential for us to really make things work? And I think we're going to touch also on why tech and data is it an inextricable part of any conversation about equitable system design today, Or is it just one of many things that we need to be accounting for? And should we perhaps be thinking more offline rather than online when we go through this? So that's an ambitious agenda for the next several minutes. So I'm going to kick it back over to you, Arathi. When it comes to digital decolonization, what is it? What are we talking about?
Thanks, Caitlin. It is an ambitious agenda, and I also want to recognize that we want to give some time for audience Q&A. So we'll try and get through some of these topics, I suppose, as succinctly as possible. So when the term decolonization to me now seems to have become a bit of a flavor du jour in 2020. We're seeing this pop up in so many spaces, and it's being used to describe a range of things. So I thought it would be good to sort of try and understand and place it, the different phrases and our different understandings of it. I like to start with a quote from James Baldwin, who says, we have a sense and a system of reality based on the assumptions that we hold. And there are a lot of assumptions that underpin humanitarian work more broadly, and certainly digital and tech work very specifically. How the word decolonization is understood in different parts of the world will depend on the specific local relationship between the colony and the colonized. So if you're talking about how decolonization is understood in Africa, for example, that's quite different from how it's understood in Southeast Asia and different from how it's understood in Latin America. But there are some key elements that come through with it. So let's start with the word colonizing. Colonizing, which is to mean, and we hear this now, people are talking about data colonialism. Colonizing, essentially means to come, to conquer, to dominate, removes power from the colonized, dispossesses, transfers economic resources, and removes culture, and usually in the name of civility, of modernizing, of progress. Now, colonialism isn't just physical, and I think this is what sometimes people miss. It is also mental and metaphysical. It displaces, removes knowledge, language, and culture. And for those of us that come from colonized countries, we also recognize that it isn't just a physical act of decolonization that we need to fight against, but it's also the mental models of decolonization. So decolonization then can be understood as the process of undoing that and restoring. And so the arguments of reparations also come into that. So if we think about indigenous communities and land grab, for example, the topic of decolonization also wraps into it, how do we provide reparations for those that have lost their land, their culture, their knowledge, etc. Decoloniality, which is a slight nuanced element of this, is a way for us then to relearn the knowledge that has been pushed aside, forgotten, buried, or discredited by the forces of modernity, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism. It's a method that aspires to restore and discover and acknowledge, and I guess in the way I understand, the way I perceive it, a way of sort of existing in a multiverse, in a plurality of worlds, in a plurality of experiences. We want to decenter, I guess, the majority perspective, the hegemonic perspective, to create a world where lots of different perspectives and experiences can come into place. One thing I want to point out, and a wonderful academic in Africa, in Southern Africa, Dr. Sabelo, talked about this, and he says that, and I resonate so much with this, that the issue of decolonization expressed by your lips differs from the decolonization that comes from within, as a revolutionary concept that speaks about rehumanization, which is a fundamental planetary project. So when I think about, and when I consider, how does all of this then transfer or translate to humanitarianism or to digital governance in humanitarian settings, I think about, often we're designing to firefight for the now, to provide protection and mitigate against risks. And your point about risk mitigation earlier, is really true. We're firefighting against the now. But is the work that we're doing, are the governance policies that we are designing, is it merely replicating the social inequities of the past in our digital futures? Because injustice and inequity is structurally designed. We design it into our policies. It doesn't happen by accident. And so therefore, as we're designing governance policies and structures, digital governance policies and structures, we ought to think about, will this lead to future indebtedness or are people going to be in the future locked into inequity by the digital policies we're designing today? Even though we're trying to firefight for the risks right in front of us, if we are not thinking about what got us here in the first place and what could be the forward implications resulting in inequity and further minoritization and marginalization, then we are not doing a job. And you'll note that I often say, I don't say minority groups, I say minoritized groups or minoritization, because when you are minoritized, you are not born into a minority. I'll stop there, and I hope perhaps that, and again, this is sort of the start of my journey to unlock what this could look like for our practice. But I'll stop there.
No, I think that was a fantastic first foray into this whole space. So again, for those of you that are watching, if you're on YouTube, please go ahead. There's a live chat feature. We're excited to get your questions directly, and I am monitoring those. If you're watching this just through the Eventbrite page, you might not be able to see the chat. So just pop on over to YouTube real quick if you want to shoot us a question. You can also always hit us up also on Twitter. We'll make sure that you've got our handles at the end of the webinar so that you can ask us all the questions. Because I really don't have anything better to do at 4 a.m. when I wake up with pandemic anxiety and election anxiety. So, Arati, I think you made a lot of really, really important points. One of them that I want to touch on is this issue of the harm that we can create, and essentially getting past these really, they're not just old or outdated, but they're increasingly obvious that they're intentional when we see whether it's big tech executives or others in the tech space try to perpetuate the myth that technology is somehow neutral, or that there are ways to perhaps, if we just had the right algorithmic auditing process, that's another big buzzword that's out there right now. If we just had the right kind of oversights, if we just get enough people checking in just the right places, we'll actually be able to remove bias, to remove these different sort of thumbs on the scales at different points in our system design. And what we see more often, and I tend to see them much more from feminist thinkers in this space, are people who are saying, essentially, bias is not something that one seeks to remove, and it's not even necessarily the objective here. The objective is to be able to name what is the lens that we're using, how does it impact then the analysis that we conduct, and the way in which we even gather and sort of pull together this material. And once we start to remove that myth of perfect neutrality, then we start to actually reckon with the realities that we're bringing to bear. So when you talk about, for example, how important it is to think about how the digital futures that we are shaping, do you see any signs pointing in good or bad direction that humanitarian organizations are actually taking ownership right now for the futures that they're creating? Or is there still a tendency towards well, our intentions are good, vaguely, therefore we don't take responsibility for any harms that might occur?
I think it's the latter. And as I say this as a humanitarian that's been in the sector for almost 18 years, I have a deep love and deep critique of the work that we all collectively do. So I want to unpack that a little bit. I think the saviorism model and the mental model pervades all of us in the sector. We think we're doing good. So that lens that we apply must be good. And yes, we know that bias infiltrates everything. We know that now, and if you don't know that, then go and do some research. There are some amazing writers, thinkers, academics, Ruha Benjamin, Joy Boalami, that are doing some incredible work in this space. So we know this as true. It's a fact. Humanitarian organizations, and this is a generalization, I'm not saying this happens in all spaces, but in humanitarian organizations, we exist in an echo chamber of people that often think like us, act like us, go forth and help the world in the same way we do. We don't listen and pay attention to different types of thinking, different types of perspectives to bring into the mix, to challenge ourselves and push us out there. So I want to give a really good example. A lot of the discussion this year that has been happening around racism in aid and decolonization of aid often talks about race. Now, I want to preface this by also recognizing my own privilege. I'm from Malaysia. I'm from the other side of the world, but I now live and work in New York. I'm going to Harvard. I recognize that I occupy a space of privilege, and I want to recognize that when I say these next words. We design these approaches in ways that consider or assume what people's experiences are going to be like. So we narrow it down to race right now, this year, because that's the big thing, or gender. We're still talking about those discussions in binaries. We're not talking about economic discrimination, class discrimination, and caste discrimination. For those of us from South Asian backgrounds in particular, we can speak of caste discrimination in very specific ways. And that gets replicated regardless of where in the world you exist and hold. Now, then, if you think about, if you're a designer working with a tech designer, a tech company, and you don't have any lived experience, or you're not listening or bringing around you people that have experiences, knowledge, understandings of what it means to go through those levels of differentiation or otherness, then it's just not going to be designed into your policies and frames. You're going to design for X because X is the big thing that we see in front of you or in front of us. And so when we think about the futures of anything, the digital futures of what we do, we often respond to a siloed risk, a siloed trend, the biggest, noisiest thing in front of us. We're not looking at the complexity of how these risks are interconnected and how they then play out to people's lived experiences in the world. So yeah, Caitlin, I do think that we as humanitarians, as humanitarian organizations, fall in the latter part of your observation. And we're not thinking about, as we're designing for the future, what is that type of multiverse we want to design so that everybody has a chance to flourish and we're not just replicating ourselves within it.
Yeah, I think that the point too could definitely be well made that for those who, when we are coming from that position of privilege, to really make sure that our discomfort in all of this is actually viewed as a sign of learning and of growth, and to be okay to even start to welcome the discomfort with this process and sitting back. And so this is a general note for any other white humanitarian ladies out there. I see you, I am you. You got to go cry in the bathroom by yourself. You don't do it in the meeting, ever. We've got some really good questions coming in as well. I'm really pleased to see some of our old friends come in. I'm going to go ahead and pull in one from Ziad Achkar, who is a PhD candidate down in the DC area. Ziad asks, on decolonization, how do we structurally rethink how we deploy digital technologies in these contexts? Especially, how do we empower local digital capacity to achieve a decolonized system? What would that look like, do you think?
Excellent question. So First of all, I want to, and I know this wasn't the intent of using the word, but and I know Ziad's work very well, and a huge fan of his thinking. But even when the narratives we use, right, the words that we use often are unconscious. So when we say the word empower, we are saying we are coming in to give power, rather than how do we amplify, how do we lift up, or sorry, facilitate a lifting up, rather than this idea that we have to come in and empower. People have their own power. So if we want to amplify local digital capacities, then understanding what that ecosystem looks like in the first place and looking at how our interventions can either support, facilitate those capacities to go to the next level, to understanding what people actually need. It's sort of like, like, I want to come back to how we design programs and projects in the first place. It's sort of like, project management 101. We say we want to do participatory design, but often communities, and I hate the phrase communities because it's still othering, but we still we bring people in, the end users of the services that we're designing, sort of halfway through the process. They are not involved at the start. I was on a panel yesterday, moderating a panel, and someone made this excellent observation. Australia in Melbourne, of course, which is my second home, has just come out yesterday or the day before out of a massive 4-month, very, very, very strict lockdown because the coronavirus cases were going up. Now, if any of us working in the humanitarian sector thought we're going to fly into Melbourne and we're just going to say, hey, here's a tech solution for contact tracing, and no, we don't care what your government has set up, we don't care what your local NGOs or civil society sectors or your own private sectors have set up, this is what we have that's bespoke to our organization and this partnership we've got, and we're going to set it up, and screw what you've got. We would never think to do that. That is unheard of for us to go into Australia to do that, but we do that all the time in other countries from other parts of the world, because our mental model is that whatever local capacities they have are not as good as what we've got. We have got to be the leader, and we've got to stamp it right. So my point is that if we want to deploy digital technologies, what is the local ecosystem like? Do they need it? Do they want it? Is this going to just come on top of or replicate something that is never going to be used? What are the long-term, midterm, and long-term repercussions of this in the multitude of ways it can play out? Or is it going to be, yet another innovation that's just going to sit there that nobody can be bothered with? How will people feel when this gets imposed down on them? And how will people live with the after effects of it? So I'll stop there, because I think we can also pull that out to cover a range of humanitarian interventions as well as humanitarian innovation interventions. But I hope that helps.
For sure. And I think one thing that always comes up whenever we're kind of like putting this into that context is, as you rightly said, how we can really start to break down those assumptions. I think just even naming, like even just starting to name what the assumptions are, that we assume that our tech or our capacity or simply ourselves are superior in some way. Usually, I mean, so we were discussing this with the Humanitarian U Aviators team, and one of the things that they really centered is that the simple use of the tech itself is never the entire objective. Even actually analyzing the data, analyzing the scenario, the emergency we're trying to address, the context and the background that a person brings to that makes massive difference in terms of their ability to not only notice subtleties, but literally to simply do basic feature identification of what is happening, what am I looking at, and what is its situation or its status on a scale of, sort of like things are okay to catastrophically bad. All of that takes a level of contextual work that we constantly import at massive expense, and usually to do, the same thing for twice as much, but half as well as it could have been done locally. There's also, of course, like I think, and this is to me one of my own pet peeves in the humanitarian space, the fact that when it comes to the human resourcing, because ultimately that's a lot of what we're talking about, how do we get the right people in the right place at the right time? We have to have some pre-existing networks and some pre-existing routes for access. And I would say opportunities for people to rapidly surface themselves in those emergency contexts, especially if they're coming to the humanitarian sector from elsewhere, but have really critical skills to apply. That work not only needs to be recognized, but it needs to be resourced rather than relying on what I'll say, this is my personal flag in it, but I think it's a very outdated and deeply elitist approach of assuming that volunteerism is the pinnacle of humanitarian activity during emergencies. When somebody's entire livelihood or their region's entire livelihood has been massively hit by some kind of disaster or conflict, it is not the time to stop paying people. Like, prepare to actually make sure people get paid. And if that means paying them in cash, prepare for that eventuality. As much as we all like our digital systems, it's not, we as humanitarians need to be resilient in the face of that, not asking those on the receiving end to be.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's where preparedness, we often, this is like the age-old argument when it comes to humanitarian response, right? Do we invest more in response because it's sexier, let's be honest, rather than preparedness? And if we want to be, and so I want to link this to the next topic, which is around the ethics. If we want to be ethical in our digital futures, then the preparedness element becomes even more integral, because it is through that preparedness that we understand what is the ecosystem, what are the technologies, what are the capacities, what are our risk appetites in order to make leveled decision making, not homogeneous decision making. And what I mean by that, often decision making is made in pockets of power rather than localized decision making. So part of that journey, in my opinion, around decoloniality in digital governance is also investing appropriate amount of thinking and resources into that preparedness, so that yes, we have the capacities and resources to pay people that are participating in that response. It is not something that's going to take, the idea or the notion that we keep being taken by surprise is no longer relevant in 2020. We ought to know better.
Absolutely. So I want to hit another couple of questions here. There's a great one by Chloe Jensen who asks, how can decolonization play into or destabilize the humanitarian principle of neutrality?
Oh, that's a much longer discussion. I don't know if I've got a right answer for that. I think we need to have another long brainstorm around that. So, Caitlin, you said you brought up the Hugo Slim paper early this week when we were chatting around, is neutrality outdated? Or is neutrality still a fit principle for our futures? So I've kept arguing this for the last 2 years because it was never a very popular argument, I have to admit. But the fundamental principles that underpin humanitarian work are relevant, are still important, are still valid. The question I think we ought to be asking is, how do they need to be transformed for our very complex futures, right? We are entering a world, or we are in an existence right now where risks are interconnected. It isn't that the global, and I do not use these terms lightly, but isn't like countries in the global north are the harbingers, is that the right pronunciation? Harbingers of all things truthful and right and ethical, and we are imposing that on the uncivilized global south. I'm being very general there, because we're not. We know now that all countries all over the place, all institutions, governments, societies are not practicing those principles of neutrality or ethics in the way that we think it ought, in the way it ought to be practiced. So does decolonization destabilize the idea of neutrality? I don't actually know the answer to that. Does it need to be a binary argument? Do we need to rethink what we understand neutrality to be? A couple of years ago, I ran a massive process around the futures of humanitarianism, where I, spoke to tens of thousands of people, inputs, etc., about what people felt was most strong. And anyway, one of the inputs that came out of that, insights that came out of that, was this really strong idea that a lot of people felt that neutrality does not mean silence. Neutrality in our current state and moving forward does not mean standing up, standing silent when there are so many things that are atrocious around us. And so maybe we need to reframe that. That's not a straightforward answer, Chloe, because I don't actually know what that answer is, but I think it's warranting a different debate, and maybe that can be a follow-up to this.
I think it's one that's massively important. I brought it up partly also to echo back to that outdated myth of tech neutrality, and instead to sort of pose that, like, what is considered neutral is really often actually conflated with the idea of a default. And that's exactly what we are challenging with decolonization and with an intersectional approach to humanitarian futures, which is that, no, we are challenging this sense of what has been standard when we think about standard setting. And we're challenging, and as you said, we're offering not just a binary opposite to, but an entire spectrum of opportunities, perspectives, ways of approaching different things. I think that one thing that also struck me when I was reading one of the well-known sort of ethnographies of MSF, and sort of as they go through, as MSF has famously challenged this idea of neutrality in the field over its tenure. And one of the things that gets constantly brought up there is that, unlike in terms of some of their main policy choices in differentiating themselves from the ICRC and Federation, they've made some key choices about making sure that it's always very clear that they are aligned on the side of the civilian, that they are, while as, of course, especially in that sort of the purest medical sense of treating the patient that's on your table, regardless of who that person is. Like that, I think, is sort of certainly an ideal of neutrality that is well worth like enshrining and holding, as like really making sure that that does remain in place. And also that scenario is in some ways more exception than the rule when we have a lot of different spectra to be working along, and we have to also make clear that our alignment as humanitarians are with the people that we seek to serve as beneficiaries, particularly in situations of conflict.
Can I come back on that and maybe just, is that okay? So there's a couple of things I want to flesh out a little bit. So let's talk about MSF. MSF this year set up operations in America and in Italy, traditionally considered developed countries. Why? Because health systems were fundamentally broken in both spaces and unable to respond to the pandemic. Now, at the time that they were setting it up, there was a lot of discussion around, oh, we're moving into a developed country. And this resonates with my point earlier, this idea of developing where need is and where vulnerability, those lines are blurring. So we find ourselves in a space where we're still othering, but actually we're all now caught up in this space together. The complexities of our future impact all of us. It's not just, I'm a humanitarian, I'm protected from this, I'm coming there. Like, does that make sense? So that borders between, and MSF there was a lot of debate even from an outsider looking in. I keynoted something for them earlier this year, and there was that lot of debate within MSF about where do we work and do we have a space to go in there. I want to touch on something as well that was something about what you said, Caitlin, around accountability. And I think we say the words that we're accountable to the people that we serve, but I don't know if I'm going to be really provocative and suggest that that's not true. I'm going to use the word we here because I am acknowledging that I'm caught up in the entire system that we exist in, right? I'm not sitting on the outside passing criticism. Why have most conversations around digital ethics in the humanitarian space only gone so far to cover data ethics, and by that I mean data protection, data privacy? We haven't, and this is one of the things that I've been unpacking in this last, as I started my fellowship, is I don't really understand why that was. Why have we only started and remained in data versus policy governance? And it's because of where our legal liabilities start and end. how we have a legal, we are very clearly legally liable. There's a legal liability when it comes to data, not necessarily in policy governance. And so we pay more emphasis on the data side of things versus the policy governance side of things. I'm still uncovering this, so I'm not saying that this is fact, but that's my understanding so far. The
And
second,
that's certainly what we see too when it comes to like the emphasis on protection and privacy. We now have, particularly with the GDPR and with California's new regulations, we have actual additional guidance and movement forward on this. But the questions of privacy, especially from a humanitarian sense, are one very, very limited section.
Absolutely limited, but because there's a clear liability there, that's what we engage in. When we don't have a legal liability, so we don't have to do it, then we don't, right? So let's talk about broader community engagement and accountability then, because this goes broader than just technology deployment. Often we say we're there on behalf of the communities that we're serving. We actually know we're accountable to our donors and our funding structures. We're accountable to our leadership and who wants to put the brand of something on something, not to the communities we serve. And that's why they get missed out. Now, to uncover this, to unpack this, to transform this, to take a decolonial feminist approach to this requires for us to not just play at the surface level of transformation. And I want to come back and bring the cycle back to the first question you asked, Caitlin. What is decolonization not? Decolonization is not a replacement, it's not a word to replace inclusion. And it's not a word, which is what it's being used for. Okay, let's get a whole bunch of brown and black people together. Okay, we've decolonized this conversation. Decolonization is also not a replacement for social change or transformational change. So to decolonize something means we need to look at, it's not an emotive response. It's not okay, let's bring a bunch of angry brown people, black people together to debate this. No, if we are going to do this, it is a structured, systemic approach to understand how decision-making needs to change, how investments need to change, how our policy and advocacy needs to change, how our HR and hiring practices need to change, how we have to take a long-termism, ancestral, generational mindset to the work that we do, because transformation isn't going to happen in, when RIT comes and goes, or the next, whatever, the amazing amount of people that are working in this space right now. It's a generational thing. So it's a structured, systemic approach to how we think about this. But if our accountability only goes so far to our donors and we're not transforming that, if we're not digging deep into the strengths and courage and bravery of our wombs and our uteruses, because I'm a feminist, so that's the analogy I'm going to use, to be braver in our advocacy, then this stuff is not going to change. I'll stop. So I guess I want to preface this idea of, can we be in our digital futures as we're designing, much more equitable, just digital governance structures? Can we take a different mindset where we are advocating and pushing for an obligation, not just to the now, but to our future generations, to our future planet, and to our ecosystem, to have a much more, to expand our ideas and mindsets about where our obligations lie, and not just the firefighting of today. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
No, it absolutely does. And I think you're weaving together a lot of really important pieces of this. And that question always of, right, the firefight versus the long-term strategy is always going to be a tension that we have to address. Pretending it doesn't exist doesn't help us to actually make progress. I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier on, well, first of all, on power structures and accountability. I do think that's a really excellent point. There's definitely a lot of folks in the data governance space who I'm sure will be applauding madly on the internet about this. I think one of the things that also really came up, so we were talking about MSF and this sort of like highlighting their move into the US space, into more developed nations. There was also really notably, as I'm sure you remember, a big uproar about another very well-known INGO, Samaritan's Purse, which had set up a field hospital in New York at the height of the first COVID spike. And not only did they get a fair amount of attention for simply the fact that there was an international NGO present to help support humanitarian aid, but also the fact that Samaritan's Purse's policies and the actions of its leadership were not at all considered kosher for many of the people who would then be receiving that aid. And as a result, they actually withdrew. So this question of accountability to whom, in that case, I think one of the rare instances where the potential beneficiaries said, no, thank you. I think two questions. One, at the time, did you see that? Did that seem to be representative of the actual, the people of New York who most clearly needed access to that medical aid at the time? Or was that simply a reflection of a small but well-connected vocal minority that was able to leverage media to basically exact a price in bad PR, forcing them to withdraw?
I don't know the answer to that. I heard about that example, but I'm not going to pass myself off as an expert on anything that's happening in the US in any way. But I will draw on this. I want to I guess extrapolate from that to a broader concept around institutional trust and credibility. Yep. So if I can maybe pivot a little bit and talk about to use that example, this week Comic Relief in the UK announced that it was finally, thank God, going to stop its practice of sending celebrities to Africa and then telling their stories. Now, this has been as the result of a very long process of where people have been pushing back on this idea that you have to, that your practices of an organization, the trust that you engender, doesn't impact or will not affect whether people trust you and want to come to you for services. In fact, it does. And we talk a lot about how the trust and credibility of institutions, we often talk about that in terms of, do our donors trust us? Do our funders trust us? Do our government partners trust us? But if those that are receiving our services or our partner receiving our services do not feel safe to come to us, do not feel trusted and credible when they come to the institution, then that is a significant organizational risk. But it's something we don't pay as much attention to. So without going into the details of Samaritan's Purse, because I don't know the full details of that, I would posit that perhaps it's a mixture of the two. That this idea that regardless of if we're not cleaning up the insides of our institutions, and we can, we want to, it's that argument around when BLM was, as BLM was exploding, right? Everybody started talking about diversity and inclusion, and you just have to look at an organization's board and go, if you're not, if your internal organizational structures does not reflect the change that you are positing externally and exogenously, then you have your credibility gets taken down a little bit. I know we're running out of time, but if I might, I just want to come back to 2 points. And I know we can go so much further. And I see Archie in the background, your little dog.
That's right. Sorry, folks. This is my co-presenter here, chronically late, just really tough to deal with. Contract negotiations have been stalling out over the issue of how many baths he has to take in a year. So.
So there's 2 things, and it's all, I guess, linking back to this idea of trust as an institution, etc., how credible we are. But I want to talk about how the idea then of our rights, our digital rights, might need to evolve. And do we need new forms of digital rights? I argue, yes, absolutely. And I would love to unpack that and work out what that might look like in a world that, if we are designing futures that are decolonial, that are equitable and just. Do our digital rights need to evolve? Because yes, a lot of what I'm seeing now, particularly post-COVID, as everybody is digitizing and people want to put in digital transformation strategies, is, that's another app, or it's a platform, or is this and that. And I see red flags going off because, again, that design of policies and governance structures that are inequitable, we're just going to translate it. And rights might get missed through that process, and new forms of digital rights might get missed through that process. And digital rights that are linked to planetary rights, that are linked to planetary and ecosystem rights are two things that I wanted to unpack. And the last point I just want to make, I didn't say this, someone else said this, but it's just resonated with me for so long. When we're coming up with another technology solution, or we think that there's a techno-solutionism approach, we're gonna put this out. There's two things I want to posit. Is that reductionist? Are we reducing the impacts of what that might look like? And two, are you really the right one to be coming up with this solution? Or maybe what you should just do is actually just step out of the way. And yeah, I'll stop there.
No, I think so. At Signal, we've long been fans of the notoriously cantankerous Evgeny Morozov and his work, especially on techno-solutionism, which I think is actually very well informed from his perspective of more authoritarian regimes where, yeah, technology is not necessarily your solution unless you're the one who got to design it. So again, getting back to how are we actually navigating all of this? I know that we're tight on time. For those who've been commenting in the chat, I'm gonna be trying to actually capture as many of your questions as we can for some follow-up blog writing. We know that this is only the beginning of these conversations. And for those of you who are interested, please do reach out to us at hhi._signal, or you can reach myself or Arathi on Twitter and get involved with the next stage of what we do on the Signal Code, because we're going to be taking all of this tough work that we're trying to sort of wrangle here and start putting some pen to paper, figuring out what kinds of solutions, or at least what kinds of approaches we can actually start to take. And I think, Arathi, to your point earlier again on the question of accountability, we need to be listening. It seems clear that we need to also be listening better to the communities that we seek to serve and not only finding, but then prioritizing ways of making sure that when they're telling us, or when they're telling the humanitarian aid providers that even accessing their aid is what is it costing them? How is it costing them? Would they prefer to have alternatives? That kind of feedback clearly needs to be increasingly elevated, so that it's not just a question of, cool, did we fulfill our quota, or did we, successfully get all of A to point B, but was it actually, could it be used in the way that we were hoping it was? And importantly, how are we actually capturing that critical perception data? Which is also an area where there's lots to talk about in terms of the science and technique of how to do all of that. Again, we're out of time, so future webinar topics. Arathi, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your wisdom with us. I know that you have expressed far more humility here than we typically see. And I just want to say that I think that one of the reasons we were so excited to have you join us is because following your example, I think that we can all do a lot better. So thank you for being such a good model for me and for so many of us in the humanitarian sector. With that, just a quick reminder, folks, again, this is 1 of 4, so you can tune in same time next week. We're going to be talking about critical cartography and how all of these politics and issues come into play when we look at something that seems like it could be deceptively simple and straightforward, maps. So come back and we'll pick it up there. Thanks again.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, everybody. And thank you for embracing my curious journey as we unpack this. And if anybody wants to work through what digital decolonization in the humanitarian world might mean, please reach out to Caitlin, to myself, etc. And let's together we are better. Thanks,
Absolutely.
everybody.